Hello everyone, and welcome to our second bite-sized learning module as part of our Modern Slavery Impact Initiative. These are a series of short conversations we're having with experts throughout Australia on key modern slavery risk issues for businesses in the country. So my name is Caskey, and I'm the Human Rights Manager at the UN Global Compact Network Australia, and it's my pleasure today to be joined by Professor Justine Nolan from the University of New South Wales. So Professor Nolan is the Director of the Australian Human Rights Institute. She's also a Professor at the Faculty of Law and Justice in UNSW. She's also one of the key drivers of business and human rights in Australia and an accomplished author on modern slavery, human rights and supply chain transparency. So thank you very much, Justine, for being on the program.
Pleasure.
So we're here today to talk about supply chain due diligence. And so in the business context, I know we speak about due diligence in a lot of contexts. We talk about it in M&A and purchasing and the like. But in this context, in human rights and modern slavery, what are those things and how does due diligence apply to them?
So modern slavery is a term that is starting to become a lot more resonant with people since Australia's introduced the law. Mm-hmm. But it's basically thinking about it as a severe form of exploitation. And the Australian Modern Slavery Act sort of lists a number of these, because modern slavery itself is an umbrella term. So things like trafficking in persons, slavery, servitude, forced labour, debt bondage, deceptive recruiting, the worst forms of child labour and forced marriage are all part of that sort of modern slavery package. But the way to think about modern slavery is more that it exists on a continuum of exploitation, of sort of bad working conditions, gradually worsening and then leading to the most severe forms of exploitation. And it's very hard to tackle sort of one of those abuses. And that's where human rights due diligence has come in, because what it's talking about is a holistic process, or more of a bundle of sort of processes whereby companies can identify, track, prevent and mitigate human rights harms in their operations and supply chains. It was introduced by the UN Guiding Principles in 2011, and since that time has started to become, or is starting to become, more resonant with companies as they look at what processes they might use to address harms in their supply chains.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. And so I suppose if I go a little bit broader, the UN Global Compact came in at the turn of the century. We've had companies committing to the universal human rights, or the human rights included in the Universal Declaration since the early millennium. We then had the UN Guiding Principles in 2011. And so there's been quite a bit of work done to try and understand what that means for businesses, but I feel like the due diligence piece is evolving over time. So how do you think it's evolved, and where are we now?
Yeah, I think it is evolving, and I also think you're right that it's still a little bit amorphous. It's still, I think it's still not, that doesn't have a lot of clarity still. It's got big picture clarity, but we've still got to dig down as to what it is and what it isn't. And it's starting to become more mainstream in part because while it was developed in the UN Guiding Principles in 2011, it has since been taken up, particularly in the OECD guidelines and various sector-specific guidelines by the OECD, which provide quite a bit of detail about what human rights due diligence is. But what we've seen in the last couple of years is that it's also starting to be incorporated into some new laws. So in the last few years in France, in Norway, in the Netherlands and Germany, we've now got laws that mandate human rights due diligence for certain companies that must be conducted in relation to their supply chain. There's also a directive with the EU that's under consideration now and active drafting, which would mandate environmental and human rights due diligence up and down supply chains for companies in Europe or operating in Europe. In our region, the New Zealand government also has under active consideration a proposal around the necessity to conduct human rights due diligence. So in the Australian Modern Slavery Act, it encourages but doesn't mandate human rights due diligence. But what we're seeing is a lot more agitation and I think pressure on companies and also the Australian government to think about what we might mandate around requirements beyond and sort of an annual reporting requirement. So it is a process that is evolving, will continue to evolve, and I think will be developed more clearly both in theory and practice in a few years.
So if I'm a company and I'm subject to the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, I've got the UN Guiding Principles here, at the international level. What do I actually have to concretely do?
Yeah, so as I said, it's a little bit amorphous, but I think sometimes it's easier to start by what it's not, and we can come back to this, but human rights due diligence is not simply conducting a one-off social audit. Mm-hmm. So a social audit isn't a proxy for a more holistic process that human rights due diligence refers to. The essence of the concept is that it's asking a company to look outward. So it's looking at the risk a company poses to others as opposed to the risks that a company might face itself. And in terms of practical elements of, what we might consider effective sort of action that would incorporate human rights due diligence. So I think it comes down to prioritising meaningful, safe and direct stakeholder engagement. So that means trying to get engagement with workers and their representatives. So it might be unions, it might be civil society organisations, it might be human rights experts, but it means reaching out beyond sort of the safe space within a company and talking with stakeholders outside at how you can do that well. It also very much, I think, involves collaboration with peers and often working through multi-stakeholder forums so that you work together, so that each company isn't sort of reinventing the wheel around due diligence. The idea of human rights due diligence is that you're embedding it in strategic decision making at board level across company functions, so you don't have siloed approaches within companies, and also that you're using it to inform responsible purchasing practices, so that impacts supply chains. And finally, that you are using it to think about if something is found, then how might that due diligence inform remediation? What would that process look like within a company? Who's a company working with to remediate processes, and how's that done?
Fantastic. And so, I mean, and this is something we've seen quite a bit. A lot of that stuff sounds quite, not necessarily simple, but easy to do in theory. You say, well, why can't a company put in place a process to engage with their workforce and then have touch points throughout their supply chain? What challenges do you see companies having in that space?
Well, I think the first step to recognise that it's really not easy, and often it's a process that needs to be well resourced. And this is perhaps, I think, where companies have underinvested in the past, but are increasingly recognising that both in relation to their impacts on climate, environment, human rights, that it is increasingly demanded by the market, that they're placing more emphasis on this. So I think the first step is basically to get visibility over a supply chain. So you can't fix what you don't know about. You need to understand your suppliers, but you need to also have better understanding of your suppliers' suppliers. And you need to understand where you have leverage, either by yourself as a company or working with peers and other stakeholders that might support action. Second, as I mentioned, I think it's really to prioritise stakeholder engagement. So sometimes I think companies spend a lot of time working around trying to get stakeholder engagement. So the use of technology and apps might be useful in this, but probably not the sole aspect of it. You have to try and figure out how to engage with workers, their representatives, to get some of that direct contact and bring workers in as monitors of their workplace. Thirdly, I think it's about putting in place measures to address the concerns that are identified, because if you're just gathering information but not acting on it, then any trust that you're building with a supplier or with their workers will break down. So it's thinking about what action you're going to take to address problems that are raised. And finally, it's about assessing how your business model might actually be creating some friction in a supply chain. I think really addressing these issues in the future is going to require companies to be a bit innovative and think about what transformative practices they might need to trial in relation to this. How can you do things differently, sustainably, but also profitably? And that's not by sort of using the business as usual model in this field.
So I suppose one of the other things I just wanted to touch on quickly, and we spoke about this a little bit earlier, is the nature of using social audits. If I was a company, again, putting myself in the company head, I would go, well, I've got a whole bunch of tools at my disposal, one of those being an audit mechanism that I would try and, if I have something I need visibility of, I would have an audit over it. We know social audits pose particular challenges. Could you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so the social audit is a technique that's been used in this field, for 20, 30 years now. And particularly research has found in the last 2 decades that it's actually increasingly has limited utility as a tool. What a social audit can do is provide a particular snapshot in time. And it may or may not identify, because sometimes it can give you false comfort that if the social audit isn't being done well and you see there are no problems, that you can sort of move on and say everything's fine here. But a social audit that is done well with some more meaningful engagement from workers can provide you with some oversight. But again, it tends to be this one-off procedure. And too often social audits are done sort of in a checklist mode with it. So the UN Guiding Principles actually reference social auditing, but just as one part of human rights due diligence, not as sort of a proxy for the whole process. I think that what's important is to understand, if you're using a social audit, that it does have some limitations. And one of the limitations is that it tends to be superficial in nature. So it's often done, over a day or perhaps 2 days, 1 or 2 years, or even 5 years intervals. So you're not getting a sort of a consistent approach about what's happening in a factory. The current social auditing model also tends to promote a coercive culture, so that might actually encourage corruption and cheating with suppliers, because it's almost using the threat of compliance rather than trying to build an engagement and a collaborative process. Social audits are rarely a collaborative process. They may often involve interviews with the board or with management, rarely so with workers. But those interviews are not always trying to get out and promote a culture of trust that would lead to change. So I think that if a social audit's being used, it's good to understand its limitations. And the other thing I think about social audit is they tend to focus on the symptoms and not the root causes of problems. So the root causes are why these labour violations are persisting. What is going on in the supply chain? What might be wrong with the business model? And the symptoms might be something like wage discrepancies or forced overtime. So it might be highlighting those, but then it's often not providing companies with a method of digging down and addressing those root causes. So if a company is using social audits, I think there's a couple of things to think about. Understand their limitations, but also think about how you can do it in a way that meaningfully and safely involves workers. Secondly, I think that the more transparent you are around an audit system, so that when it has been conducted, that the information's made public, that workers have an opportunity to comment on that information, so you almost have like a 360-degree loop around it. And that within the audit process is built in recommendations around remediation. So you're not just identifying problems, but you're also figuring out how can this process help us remediate them.
Fantastic. And it's something we've been looking at the Global Compact recently. It's using that transparency almost as currency as opposed to compliance, right? Because that's when you start to drive that engagement and actually get real change on the ground. Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much, Professor Nolan. That's it for this episode, everyone. If you'd like to learn more about the UN Global Compact, please visit us at unglobalcompact.org.au. I'll link some of the resources that we spoke about in today's session in the description below. Other than that, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.